Judge Evelyn Cartwright laughed moments before everything unraveled. The courtroom in Santa Ana, California hummed with low murmurs as Judge Evelyn Cartwright adjusted her glasses, her manicured fingers drumming lazily against the wooden bench. She had presided over thousands of cases, each one blending into the next. Just another face, just another story. At the defendant's table stood Lawrence Bennett, a well-dressed black man in his late 40s. His suit was sharp, his posture straight, but none of that seemed to matter to Judge Cartwright. She barely glanced up from the papers in front of her. To her he was just another case number, just another man trying to argue his way out of trouble. She leaned back in her chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth, the kind of smirk that said she already had her mind made up. "Well, Mr. Bennett, let me guess," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "This is all just one big misunderstanding. Or maybe the system is just unfair to you?" A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. The bailiff, a burly man who had worked alongside her for years, allowed himself a smirk. The prosecutor, a young woman eager to impress, kept her eyes on her notes, but couldn't suppress the slight curve of her lips. Lawrence didn't flinch. He stood there calm, collected, as if he had expected this. He let the laughter settle before he finally spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I believe if you actually read the case file, you'd understand that I'm not the defendant." Judge Cartwright blinked. The smirk faltered. "What did you say?" Lawrence tilted his head slightly. "I'm not the defendant in this case. In fact, I'm the one who brought it to your court." Silence fell over the room. The judge's eyes flicked to the file in front of her, her fingers tightening around the edges. Something was off, she had assumed, but she wasn't about to admit that. Instead, she scoffed, flipping through the pages with exaggerated care. "Then, why exactly are you standing at the defendant's table?" Lawrence reached into his suit pocket. The prosecutor stiffened. The bailiff took a step forward, hand hovering near his holster. Judge Cartwright's eyes narrowed, but when Lawrence pulled out a sleek leather wallet and flipped it open, the entire courtroom changed in an instant. The air grew thick, the murmurs stopped, and Judge Cartwright's smirk disappeared completely. A badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a United States Secret Service badge. But that was just the beginning. Judge Cartwright's lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered between the badge and Lawrence's face, as if she had suddenly misread the entire situation. The prosecutor stiffened, stealing a glance at the judge, while the bailiff took an unconscious step back. The gallery, moments ago entertained by the judge's casual mockery, now sat in stunned silence. The weight of what they had just witnessed settled in the room like thick fog. Lawrence didn't move. He held the badge up, just long enough for everyone to see, before slipping it back into his pocket. "I was undercover investigating corruption," he said, his voice as even as before. But this time, his words cut through the room like a blade. "And Judge Cartwright, your name has come up more than once." A slow, uneasy breath left the judge's lips. She was usually the one in control, the one who decided the fates of others, with the casual drop of a gavel. But now she felt something creeping in, something she hadn't felt in years. Pressure. Her grip on the gavel tightened. "Excuse me," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. Lawrence exhaled slowly, taking his time before answering. "For the past 6 months we've been investigating a network of judicial corruption in Orange County: bribes, unlawful sentencing, collusion with private prison executives." His gaze locked onto hers, "and a pattern of disproportionately harsh rulings against black defendants." Judge Cartwright let out a sharp laugh, a forced, brittle sound. "This is absurd," she scoffed. "Is this some kind of joke?" Lawrence didn't react. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a folded document. He stepped forward, placing it on the bench in front of her. Cartwright hesitated before unfolding the paper. Her eyes moved across the page, scanning the letterhead, the signature at the bottom. The Department of Justice. A formal notification, an active investigation. Her name listed among several others. Her throat felt dry. This wasn't a bluff. She opened her mouth to speak, to refute, to dismiss, but nothing came out. The courtroom was no longer hers, and she knew it. Judge Cartwright's hands trembled slightly as she stacked the documents together, pressing them down on the bench, as if that would make them disappear. But no amount of courtroom theatrics could undo what had just happened. The murmurs in the gallery had turned into something deeper, an undercurrent of recognition, of realization. People who had spent years believing in the weight of her gavel were now seeing the cracks in the foundation. The prosecutor was no longer taking notes. Her pen sat motionless on the legal pad, her face carefully neutral. She had built her career under Cartwright, but she wouldn't go down with her. The bailiff's radio crackled softly at his hip. He shifted his stance, a subtle but telling move. And Lawrence, he was still watching, still waiting. "You're grasping at straws," Cartwright finally said, her voice tight. "There's no proof of wrongdoing, just speculation, cherry-picked cases." A new voice interrupted. "That's not true, Your Honor." A man stood up in the gallery, mid-50s, graying at the temples, wearing a dark blue suit. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Whitaker." The shift in the room was immediate. Cartwright's face paled. "Whitaker, we've been compiling evidence for months." Whitaker continued, stepping forward. His voice carried the weight of authority, of finality. "Bribery, case fixing, intentional over-sentencing in exchange for political favors." He turned toward the court clerk. "Would you please read the docket number for the federal filing against Judge Cartwright?" The clerk hesitated, then looked down at her screen. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Case number 20 for CR 1785. A collective exhale rippled through the gallery. Cartwright's mask of composure began to crack. "This is outrageous," she hissed. "A disgraceful attempt to judge Cartwright." Whitaker interrupted, his tone firmer. "Now you are officially under investigation. Effective immediately, you are removed from the bench. Federal authorities will be escorting you from the courthouse." Silence. Cartwright's fingers tightened around her gavel, as if she could reverse everything with a single slam. But for the first time in decades, she wasn't the one giving orders. Two federal marshals stepped into the courtroom. The air turned electric. The gallery leaned forward, eyes locked onto the judge, who had once ruled with absolute confidence. Now she was the one waiting for a verdict. One of the marshals, a tall woman with cropped brown hair, stepped closer. "Judge Cartwright, please step down." Cartwright looked around as if expecting anyone to defend her, but there was no one. Her gaze flickered to the prosecutor, but the young woman stared at her notes, suddenly very interested in the edge of the legal pad. She turned to the bailiff, her bailiff, but he was already looking away, one hand gripping his radio. Even the court clerk, the woman who had sat beside her for years, avoided her gaze for the first time. Cartwright was truly alone. Slowly she rose from her seat. The gavel sat abandoned on the bench. She opened her mouth as if to argue, to command, to reclaim the authority slipping through her fingers. But she said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. As the marshals led her toward the exit, the gallery erupted into whispers, and Lawrence, Special Agent Bennett, watched with quiet satisfaction. Justice, after all, had a way of balancing itself out. But what happened next was even more unexpected. The heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Judge Cartwright, leaving only the echoes of her forced footsteps. As the federal marshals led her away, the room remained tense, as if no one had quite processed what had just unfolded. For years she had ruled over lives, made decisions that shaped futures with the flick of her wrist, but today the weight of her own actions had finally caught up with her. A low hum of conversation swept through the gallery. rising and falling in waves. Some whispered in disbelief, others nodded, as if they had suspected something was off all along, but never imagined they'd see justice catch up to her so publicly at the prosecutor's table. The young woman who had once looked up to Cartwright was motionless, staring at her own hands as though reassessing every case she had ever argued before. This judge, the bailiff, adjusted his belt, his posture different now, less rigid, less obligated. And at the defense table, a man who had come expecting to leave in handcuffs sat frozen in his chair, eyes locked on the empty judge's bench. He had come for a sentencing. Instead, he had witnessed something few ever did. A judge held accountable. Lawrence remained standing, watching the shifting energy in the room. This wasn't just about Cartwright. It was about something bigger. A door had been opened, a precedent had been set. But there was one more thing to take care of. He turned toward Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Whitaker. The two men exchanged a knowing look. The investigation wasn't over. Cartwright was just the beginning. Whitaker nodded. "We'll be in touch with that." Lawrence stepped away from the defense table and adjusted his suit. He had done his job, but something told him this wouldn't be the last time he walked into a courtroom like this. Not as a defendant, not as a witness, but as the man making sure justice wasn't just a word, it was action. And that's what the system had been missing for far too long. But this was only the start. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters clutched microphones. Camera crews adjusted their lenses, and spectators, some former defendants, some just curious onlookers, murmured amongst themselves. The news had spread fast. A sitting judge, removed from the bench in the middle of court. Federal marshals had taken Judge Cartwright through the side exit, away from the growing chaos. But the damage had already been done. Her reputation wasn't just stained, it was obliterated. Lawrence stepped outside, squinting against the midday sun. He wasn't interested in the media circus unfolding in front of him. This wasn't about the headlines. It never was. He adjusted his suit, exhaling slowly as Whitaker caught up to him. The assistant U.S. attorney looked exhausted, but there was something else in his expression, something close to satisfaction. "We have enough to push for a full trial," Whitaker said. "More than enough, actually. The evidence you and your team collected, it's airtight." Lawrence nodded. "Good." Whitaker studied him for a moment, then shook his head with a dry chuckle. "I have to ask, why do this?" Lawrence turned toward him. The question wasn't unexpected, but it still carried weight, because it wasn't just about Cartwright. It was about the system she represented, the lives she ruined, the quiet suffering of people whose names never made the news. She thought no one was watching. Lawrence finally said, she thought she could do whatever she wanted, and no one would stop her. He let the words settle before finishing. "I just made sure she was wrong." Whitaker exhaled, nodding slowly. "Well, we could use more people like you." Lawrence didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped off the courthouse steps and disappeared into the city. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today was a win. Power without accountability is a ticking time bomb. Judge Cartwright ruled over countless lives, believing she was untouchable. But today, justice proved otherwise. How many more corrupt officials hide behind their titles? How many lives have been destroyed by those who see justice as a tool for their own gain? This may be fiction, but the reality is far too common. Have you ever seen injustice and felt helpless? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe the truth needs a voice, like, share, and subscribe, because real justice begins with awareness.